Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to an earlier edition of Live Chat with James here on ProPix TV at the studios in Vancouver, British Columbia. Tonight we are taking a special look, or a special edition, to look at the murder on the high seas. The U.S. attacking a fishing vessel that they declare or claim was being run by a drug syndicate and cartel. They also claim that the ship was loaded, or the vessel was loaded with tons of cocaine or other narcotics that were heading towards the coast of the United States. This, of course, is a huge international law breach, as well as a breach of so many other maritime laws and other regulations, not only at the international level, but of course on a U.S. stage as well. This has essentially made Donald Trump, Pete Hegseth, and others directly a judge, jury, and executioner in the lives of these alleged drug smugglers. We're going to break down all of the aspects of this matter in today's special edition here. If you want to call in and have your voice heard on this topic, regardless as to which side you are on, by all means, please feel free to dial in via telephone or WhatsApp. The number is 1-368-997-6741. Once again, you can call in live at 1-368-997-6741. Now, as I said, the reports came out quick and swift from the Trump administration. However, they were lacking in substance and detail. We do know that the Trump administration is taking a very serious tact and route when it comes to dealing with international drug supplies and the breach of their borders when it comes to the flow of various substances into the United States and risking the lives of American citizens. Does this, however, give them the right to be firing upon ships in the ocean, in the open ocean, in international waters? Yes, this is a big controversy that is being spoken about online by not only American citizens, but also the international political and public community. This breaches so many laws that it is just insane that it has not been talked about at greater lengths in terms of penalties or actions against the U.S. when it comes to sovereignty of other nations and their citizens. Now, as we continue to go through here, I am just going to adjust our layout here so that it is not so split there if I can. So we'll see if I can do that. And we'll go from there. Let's take a look here if we can adjust that, but I'm also going to open the chat windows. So the chat windows are now live, ladies and gentlemen. You can add to the chat room if you would like, regardless as to what platform you are on. It should come up on my screen. In addition to that, of course, we are going to have the phone lines open as of now at 368-997-6741. And again, those phone lines are active as of now. You can also call in on WhatsApp at the same number. Now let's take a look at this situation as it unfolded. Excuse me. I apologize, folks. It's been a long day. Now, with the death on the high seas, the U.S. has striked a suspected drug boat, and that is, of course, igniting legal and ethical firestorms, not just in the U.S., but as I said, from around the world. Now, this report comes to you from ProPix TV in partnership with our sister station, True Crime and Justice TV. And you can find that at truecrimeandjusticetv.com. And before we get started, also a quick shout out to this episode's sponsor, Carey Movers Limited. Yes, they are the go-to moving company for residential and commercial customers in Western Canada, providing local moving services for residences, offices, corporations, and of course, industrial equipment throughout the lower mainland, Metro Vancouver, and Fraser Valley area. They also provide long distance services throughout all of Western Canada. You can reach Carry Movers through their website at www.carrymovers.com. That's Kary movers.com. Now, let's move on. In the pre-dawn darkness of the Caribbean, approximately 150 nautical miles off the coast of Venezuela, not the US, but Venezuela, a flash of light and a concussive blast shattered the tranquility of the open ocean. A small, nondescript fishing vessel tracked for hours by US surveillance assets erupted into a ball of fire. This leaked preliminary reports describe a swift, decisive action. A U.S. Coast Guard cutter, supported by a U.S. Navy destroyer, launched a missile strike that obliterated the boat, sending it and its crew to the depths of the ocean. Now, the official U.S. statement released hours later was terse and uncompromising. The vessel was a stateless boat operated by a known drug cartel engaging in trafficking, and a multi-ton shipment of cocaine was on board destined for the American shores. The strike, a senior Pentagon official said, was a necessary and proportional response to transnational criminal threat. This is very debatable, and whether or not that gave them the grounds to be judge, jury, and executioner is even more of a concern here. As they continue to ignore domestic laws, now they are ignoring international law. Now, this is definitely something that we need to discuss, so feel free to call in. This fatal encounter on the high seas, however, has ignited a global firestorm that extends far beyond a single counter-narcotics operation. It has become a flashpoint in the contentious arena of international law, pitting it against the United States' aggressive extraterritorial law enforcement posture. Now, this again is against the foundational principles of sovereignty and freedom of navigation that have governed the world's oceans for centuries. This incident raises a cascade of urgent questions. Was this a legitimate act of law enforcement, or was it a flagrant violation of international law? An extrajudicial killing conducted with the impunity of the global commons. The answer is being fiercely debated today in the halls of the United Nations, in the foreign ministries of Latin American capitals, and across the digital battlefields of social media. At stake is not just the fate of a single vessel, but the integrity of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, also known as the UNCLOS or UNCLOS. The so-called Constitution of the Oceans that provides the legal framework for all maritime activities. Now, as Venezuela decries this act as an imperialistic aggression, and human rights organizations condemn a summary execution, the world is forced to confront whether the global war on drugs has now given a superpower license to act as judge, jury, and executioner on the high seas. This report that we are going to bring to you today is delving into the complex legal, ethical, and diplomatic fallout of this deadly strike, examining the profound challenge it poses to the international rules-based order. Now, again, of course, we know that Donald Trump and his administration don't seem to give a shit about the legal ramifications, nor do they think that they are subjected to the restriction of any law, whether it be American or international. We know that they are controlling a lot of the U.S. courts and the U.S. criminal system, and they now have taken that a step further to reach into the global community and act in such a manner. Now, of course, we know that this is not acceptable, but it appears that Donald Trump and his administration think this is highly acceptable behavior by a nation that is supposed to be adhering to the rule of law. Now, as we continue on, of course, these are murky waters in navigating the law of the sea. The U.S. justification for the strike rests on a precarious legal foundation, one that appears to crumble under the weight of established international maritime law. While Washington portrays the action as a straightforward enforcement measure, a detailed analysis of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea reveals a stark chasm between U.S. claims and its international legal obligations. The unilateral use of lethal force against a foreign flagged or potentially stateless vessel in international waters is a profound departure from norms, requiring an exceptionally high bar of legal justification, a bar the United States appears to have failed to clear. Now, as we look at the freedom of the seas, there's a foundational principle that likely has been breached. At the heart of international maritime law lies a principle forged over centuries: the freedom of the high seas. Codified in the UNCLOS, this doctrine holds that all parts of the sea, not including in a state's corollary of this, or sorry, in a state's exclusive economic zone, territorial sea, or internal waters, are all, when you look at it, open to every nation. A critical corollary of this freedom is the principle of exclusive flag state jurisdiction. A ship on the high seas is, with very few exceptions, subject only to the laws and enforcement authority of the state of which flag they fly. Now, this prevents the oceans from descending into a lawless space where the strongest navies can impose their will on a vessel of weaker states. Now, the U.S. position on UNCLOS is one of profound irony. Despite having never ratified the treaty due to objections over deep seabed mining provisions, successive U.S. administrations have accepted the vast majority of its articles, including those governing navigation and jurisdiction, as a binding customary international law. This long-standing policy makes any deviation from these norms a matter of a global concern, as it signals a potential rejection of the very rules the U.S. has historically championed and enforced. Now, the U.S. strike is, on its face, a direct violation of these foundational principles. By unilaterally using lethal force against a vessel in international waters, the United States has surpassed the jurisdictional authority that would normally belong to the flag state. This places the burden of proof squarely on Washington to demonstrate that its actions fell within one of the narrow, universally recognized exceptions to exclusive flag state jurisdiction. Now, the available evidence suggests that none of these exceptions convincingly apply, pointing not to a lawful act of enforcement, but to a deliberate breach of international legal order. This action is the physical manifestation of a deep-seated conflict between the United States domestic law and international norms. The Maritime Drug Law Enforcement Act, or the MDLEA, is a U.S. statute that asserts sweeping unilateral extraterritorial jurisdiction, permitting the interdiction of vessels on the high seas far beyond what international law typically allows. This domestic mandate is in direct opposition to the consent-based, narrowly defined exceptions codified in the UNCLOS. Therefore, the strike is not an anomaly, but the predictable result of a U.S. policy that prioritizes its own expansive enforcement agenda over the multilateral legal framework governing the oceans. Was this a chase? Was it lawful? Was it considered a hot pursuit? Now let's take a look at that, because one of the most well-known and often misunderstood exceptions to the freedom of the seas is the doctrine of high pursuit. Excuse me. Now, codified in Article 111 of the UNCLOS, this right allows coastal state to pursue a foreign vessel that has violated its laws onto the high seas and arrest it. However, this is not a blanket authority. It is a carefully circumscribed power intended to prevent criminals from using the boundary of the high seas as a shield against immediate enforcement. To be lawful, a hot pursuit must satisfy a strict set of cumulative conditions. If even one is not met, the entire legal basis of the pursuit collapses. So let's take a look at these conditions in which they should be met in order to make this a legal high pursuit situation, which obviously it was not. But we'll take a look here and I'll go through the conditions on which they need to adhere to on that. Now, the essential requirements for a valid hot pursuit are as follows. Good reason to believe. That's point number one. And that is lined here as the authorities of coastal state must have good reason to believe that the suspect vessel has violated its laws and regulations. The U.S. would claim that this was met through intelligence. Now, commencement within jurisdictional waters. Remember, it has to meet all of these, not just one of them. Now, commencement within the jurisdictional waters means that this is the most critical and geographically specific requirement. The pursuit must begin while the foreign ship or one of its boats is within the pursuing state's internal waters or other territorial sea, which is up to 12 nautical miles from the coast, or the contiguous zone from 12 to 24 nautical miles. If the violation occurred within the state's exclusive economic zone or on its continental shelf, the pursuit must also commence within these zones. Now, continuous and uninterrupted pursuit. This also applies. Again, they have to meet all of these criteria, not just one or two. They have to meet them all. Now, the continuous and uninterrupted pursuit means that the chase cannot be broken off and later resumed. It must be continuous from the moment it begins. So again, first of all, this vessel did not breach U.S. waters. It was over 1,000 miles away from the closest U.S. controlled waterways. So absolutely, in no way, shape, or form does this apply. Now, again, whether the chase was continuous or whether it started and stopped is totally irrelevant because there was never a starting point within U.S. territorial waters. So again, that makes this a complete non-argument for the U.S. to try and use. Now, they also must signal to stop. Before the pursuit begins, the pursuing vessel must give a visual or auditory signal to stop at a distance where it can be seen or heard by the foreign ship. The signal must be given while the suspect vessel is still within the coastal state's jurisdictional waters. Again, it was never in the U.S. jurisdictional waters. Now, termination of the right. The right of hot pursuit ceases the moment the pursued vessel enters the territorial sea of its own state or that of a third state. Now, it was in international waters, so again, that doesn't apply, but you can see by that criteria alone, the U.S. had absolutely no foundational purpose for blowing this ship out of the water. Now, applying to these stringent criteria to the known facts of the strike off Venezuela, the U.S. claim of hot pursuit appears legally untenable. The incident occurred, as I said, 150 nautical miles from the Venezuelan coast, placing it deep within international waters, and for the pursuit to be legal, U.S. forces would have had to initiate it while the vessel was in U.S. territorial waters or its contiguous zone. An impossibility, and again, an impossibility given the geography. The vessel was thousands of miles from the nearest U.S. territory. The single point of failure is fatal, and this one alone is fatal to any claim of hot pursuit. The U.S. cannot retroactively justify an action as being in international waters by citing a doctrine whose core prerequisite, commencement with its own jurisdiction, was not met. Now, the boarding, a right of visit exceeded. Let's take a look at how that would apply. Now, if hot pursuit does not apply, the only other potential justification under customary international law for interfering with a foreign vessel on the high seas is the right of visit. This right, codified in the UNCLOS Article 110, is even more narrowly defined than hot pursuit. It permits a warship to board foreign merchant vessel in international waters only if there are reasonable grounds for suspecting that the vessel is engaged in one of the very specific list of universally condemned activities. Now, these are piracy, the slave trade, unauthorized broadcasting. The ship is without nationality, so stateless. It's not flying a flag and does not have anything on board to identify state. And the ship, through flying a foreign flag, is in reality of the same nationality as the warship. Now, that does not apply to the US in this circumstance. Now, conspicuously absent from this list is drug trafficking. While narcotic smuggling is a serious international crime, it has not been elevated to the same level of universal jurisdiction as piracy or the slave trade, which historically allow any state to intervene. Therefore, suspicion of drug trafficking alone does not grant the United States the right to unilaterally board a foreign flagged vessel on the high seas. Such an action would require a separate bilateral or multilateral treaty within the vessel's flag state authorizing it to board. Now, furthermore, the right of visit only permits a warship to verify the ship's right to fly its flag and, if suspicions remain, to conduct a further examination on board with all possible consideration. It is a right of inquiry, not a license to use lethal force. The U.S. action, a missile strike that destroyed the vessel and killed its crew, is a grotesque and disproportionate escalation that bears no resemblances to the limited police power envisioned by Article 110. To circumvent this clear legal prohibition, the United States will almost certainly argue that the vessel was stateless. A stateless vessel enjoys no protection from any nation and can be boarded and seized by any state's warship. A vessel may be deemed stateless if it sails without a flag, refuses to show a flag, or makes contradictory claims of nationality. In past counter narcotics operations, U.S. authorities have been known to use minor discrepancies in a ship's documentation or a captain's statements to declare a vessel stateless, thereby creating jurisdiction where none actually existed. Now, the destruction of the vessel in this incident tactically convenient for such a claim. With the ship and its papers, not to mention the crew and the captain of this vessel, being at the bottom of the sea, it becomes exceedingly difficult for any international body to independently verify its flag status. This is making it easier for the U.S. to assert its own version of events and harder for others to legally challenge it. This suggests the potential for a cynical exploitation of a legal loophole where destruction of evidence is used to retroactively manufacture a basis for jurisdiction. Now, even with that, it still did not give them the right to blow this vessel out of the water and to kill the people on board. At no point was that a part of the law that is allowed in this circumstance. Now, as we continue on, of course, stretching the law, it's a constructive presence and the scheme theory. So let's take a look at that. In a further attempt to build a legal defense, U.S. officials may turn to more obscure and contentious legal doctrines that seek to extend a state's jurisdiction beyond its maritime borders. One such doctrine is constructive presence. An extension of hot pursuit, that is. This principle applies when a mother ship remains on the high seas but sends its own smaller boats, or known as daughter ships, into a coastal state's territorial waters to commit an offense. The law constructs the presence of the mothership within the territorial waters, allowing a hot pursuit to be legally initiated against it, even though it never physically entered the zone. For this doctrine, though, to apply to this strike specifically off of Venezuela, the U.S. would have to produce evidence that the targeted vessel was a mothership whose own boats had had recently committed a crime inside of U.S. territorial waters. Again, a highly improbable scenario given the vessel's location. An even more aggressive legal argument would involve invoking the nascent and controversial scheme theory of constructive presence. Now, this theory, which has been debated in legal scholarship but is not widely accepted as settled law, suggests that constructive presence can be established between two independent vessels if they are found to be cooperating in a common illegal scheme or have a unified objective. This would potentially allow the U.S. to argue that the targeted vessel was planning to rendezvous with another boat that it was heading to U.S. waters. It was part of a scheme that justified intervention. However, this is a radical interpretation that would dramatically expand the concept of extraterritorial jurisdiction. Most nations, particularly those wary of a superpower overreach, would likely reject this scheme and the theory as an illegitimate attempt to rewrite the carefully balanced rules of UNCLOS. Now, let's take a look here. We have talked about hot pursuit, so the pursuit must commence while the suspect vehicle is in coastal states' water and territory. Okay, so those jurisdictional waters, including the territorial sea, the contiguous zone, and then also the pursuit must be continuous and uninterrupted. A visual or auditory signal to stop must be given. Pursuit must cease if the vessel enters the territorial sea of another state. Now, let's take a look at that. The incident occurred in international waters off of Venezuela, making it improbable that the pursuit began in U.S. jurisdictional waters. It's just an impossibility. Now, this is a fatal flaw for the hot pursuit claim. Two, unconfirmed compliance is unknown and would be a key point of legal contention. However, it should also be made very clear that the U.S. vessels, whether it was the Coast Guard vessel or the U.S. Navy vessel, had methods in which they could have disabled that boat in the international waters had they have wanted to. They could have used non-lethal methodologies or equipment and technology to stop that vessel without blowing it out of the water, without destroying evidence, and without killing those on board. Now, of course, as I said, that part of the section is not applicable because the vessel was destroyed in international waters, but it still is seen by most around the globe as international repression, transnational repression, or just an extrajudicial murder. And that is a very big concern. So, just to oversight again, the right of visit, Article 110, is justified only for suspicion of piracy, slave trade, and unauthorized broadcasting, as well as a ship without nationality and a ship being the same nationality as the warship. Again, the suspected crime of drug trafficking, which is not listed as a justification for a unilateral visit under Article 110. The U.S. would have to argue the vessel was stateless or rely on a separate treaty or flag state consent, which they don't have. None of this is confirmed that they had any of that. So the use of lethal force is a gross violation of the doctrine's intent. Again, the constructive presence, just an overview there. An extension of hot pursuit requires that there be a mothership on the high seas to be working with its own boats or link vessels operating as a team within a state's jurisdictional waters. Again, they would require evidence that targeting the boat or this targeted boat was a mothership. though it did not seem to be possible given that any smaller craft that came from that ship would have to be entering and exiting US waters, again, thousands of miles away. So I don't see that as a probability in any event. Now, justice overboard, the ethical and human rights fallouts. Let's take a look at that. Because beyond the cold callous of or calculus of maritime law lies a profound ethical abyss. Even if the United States could construct a tenuous legal justification for its actions, the strike would still represent a grave moral and human rights failure. The decision to use military grade lethal force as a tool of law enforcement, the embrace of summary execution in the name of the war on drugs, and the unilateral assertion of a superpower's right to kill in the global commons all raise deeply troubling questions about justice, due process, and the sanctity of human life. Again, we look at this as the US acting as an international judge, jury, and executioner using lethal force as law enforcement. Completely under international law, international human rights law. The use of force by any law enforcement official is governed by strict principles of necessity and proportionality. Lethal force is a measure of absolute last resort, permissible only when strictly unavoidable in order to protect life. The US strike appears to be a clear violation of this standard, constituting a premeditated extrajudicial killing. And sorry, folks, I'm just going to check here, see if that is a message for us coming through, and it is not. So we will leave that for the moment and continue on here. Yes, always glad to see your program. Thank you, Diluar. Appreciate you speaking in and putting your comment in there. Appreciate it very much. Don't forget, folks, that you can call in live either through WhatsApp or via telephone at area code 368-997-6741 if you would like to have your opinion on this herd, or if you just want to state something about this event that has happened in the Caribbean. And let's move on back to our story here, ladies and gentlemen. We'll get back to what we were just talking about here. I'm just going to open up another little thumbnail to kind of give a different scene as opposed to staring at my silly face at this whole time. Now, as I said, the under international human rights law, the use of force by the law enforcement officials is governed by strict principles of necessity and proportionality. Okay, very clear, very clear. Now, the US strike appears to be a clear violation of the standard, constituting, as I said, a premeditated extrajudicial killing. An extrajudicial execution is an unlawful and deliberate killing carried out by order of a government or with its complicity, and is condemned as a fundamental violation of human rights. Of course, we're familiar with the recent events over the last year and a half, 2 years, with India getting caught potentially being involved in acts of transnational repression and extrajudicial killings in Canada, the US, attempted assassination, and other potential assassinations or killings in the UK as well that have yet to be proven in a court of law. But regardless, we understand the concept of extrajudicial killings in these terms. Now, the critical question is whether non-lethal means of interception were available and attempted. A modern naval destroyer and a Coast Guard cutter possess a wide array of capabilities to stop a small fishing vessel without destroying it, including deploying boarding teams using non-lethal disabling fire against its engines, or physically blocking its path. The choice to use a missile suggests that the primary objective was not to arrest suspects and seize contraband for prosecution, but instead the standard goals of law enforcement that would be, but instead to eliminate the vessel and its crew. Plain and simple, that seems to be the goal of Donald Trump and the US government in this situation. This transforms a law enforcement operation into a summary execution, denying the individuals on board any semblance of due process, including the right to a trial and the presumption of innocence. Now, this action is a dangerous escalation of a historical pattern of aggressive U.S. extraterritorial enforcement. In cases like the United States v. Eunice in 1987 and the United States v. Alvarez Machine in 1992, U.S. agents forcibly abducted individuals from foreign soil or international waters to stand trial in American courts. Now, these actions, while highly controversial and protested by other nations as violations of their sovereignty, at least maintained the pretense of a due process by bringing the suspects before a court. The strike on this suspected drug boat abandons this pretense entirely, moving it from abduction for trial to execution without a trial. It reflects a dangerous normalization of extraterritorial killing and a tactic honed in the war on terror that is now being applied to counter narcotics. For years, the US has used drone strikes for targeted killings of suspected terrorists, and public opinion has shown a degree of acceptance for these methods. By increasingly framing drug cartels as narco terrorists, the US government performs a rhetorical sleight of hand. This shift in language is not merely semantic, it serves to ethically justify applying military rule of engagement, where the killing of the enemy is the objective, to a law enforcement context which should prioritize arrest and prosecution. Again, instead, they are looking at the objective being to kill the enemy, and they are describing these drug runners, uh, alleged drug runners, as being the enemy. Is this going to be an ongoing human cost of the war on drugs? The strike must also be viewed within the broader, deeply flawed context of the global war on drugs. Human rights organizations have long argued that this punitive, militarized approach has been catastrophic in its failure, leading to widespread human rights abuses while doing little to curb the supply of or the demand for illicit drugs. A report from Human Rights Watch states that this approach has had devastating human rights consequences, including grossly disproportionate punishment, torture, and extrajudicial killings. Amnesty International has documented how counter narcotics operations have led to arbitrary detentions, enforced disappearances, and extrajudicial executions, and in some cases amounting to crimes against humanity. Very, very concerning, ladies and gentlemen. Now, the most extreme recent example is the war on drugs in the Philippines under former President Rodrigo Duterte. Now, that was where police and their agents have been implicated in the extrajudicial killings of thousands of people, most from the impoverished urban areas. Investigations have found that police routinely falsify evidence, planting guns and drugs on victims' bodies to justify the killings. We've seen the same type of allegations in India. Now, while the US strike is a single incident, it shared the same underlying logic that summary execution is an acceptable tool for drug control. It bypasses the legal system in favor of brute force, and in doing so, it echoes the very abuses the US has condemned elsewhere. Furthermore, these policies disproportionately harm the most vulnerable. The victims are rarely the kingpins of transnational criminal organizations, but are often low level couriers, impoverished fishermen, or marginalized individuals coerced into the drug trade. By destroying the vessel, the US has not only denied the crew their right to life, but it's also erased their identities, making it easy to label them as hardened narco terrorists without evidence. Now, let's take a look at sovereignty versus security and a superpower's prerogative. The incident lays bare a fundamental tension in the international system, the conflict between the sovereign right of states to be free from external interference and the claimed right of a powerful state to protect its national security from transnational threats. The ethical framework here of international law embodied in the UN Charter is built on the principle of sovereign equality. Unilateral military action undermines this entire structure. When a powerful state decides for itself what constitutes a threat and acts outside of the established multilateral framework of the UN Security Council, it asserts a special prerogative that is denied to others. This is not just an attack on a boat, ladies and gentlemen. It is an attack on the principle that all states are bound by the same rules. Now, the use of overwhelming technological force exacerbates this ethical imbalance. A naval destroyer and advanced aerial surveillance pitted against a small fishing boat is not a symmetrical conflict. It is an execution enabled by technology. This asymmetry creates an ethical hazard. When a target can be identified and eliminated from a safe distance with zero risk to the operators, the psychological and moral threshold for using lethal force is significantly lowered. The decision to destroy the boat rather than attempt a difficult and potentially dangerous boarding is made easier and more likely by the technological gap. The path of least resistance becomes the path of the greatest destruction, and the one most likely to violate fundamental human rights. Now, of course, right now the world is divided and it's creating a diplomatic firestorm. The US strike has sent shockwaves through the international community, triggering a diplomatic crisis that has exposed deep geopolitical fault lines. The reactions, of course, ranging from furious condemnation to muted calls for restraint, illustrate how the incident is being interpreted not merely as a legal or ethical breach, but as a strategic move in a larger global contest for influence and power. Now, Crocus condemnation and imperialist aggression. So let's take a look at that. For Venezuela, the attack is a culmination of years of perceived U.S. hostility. The government of President Nicolas Maduro immediately and vehemently condemned the strike as an act of imperialist aggression and a bloody threat. In a series of heated statements, Venezuelan officials have framed the entire U.S. counter narcotics deployment in the Caribbean as a false narrative and a pretext for invasion aimed at regime change. Foreign Minister Ivan Gil, I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly, that the U.S. is fabricating a drug trafficking threat in the Caribbean to justify military buildup, citing UN data suggesting that the majority of cocaine from the region is trafficked via the Pacific, not the Caribbean. Now, this narrative resonates powerfully within Venezuela and among its allies, tapping into a long history of U.S. intervention in Latin America. The Venezuelan government has responded by mobilizing its own military forces along its coast and urging citizens to enlist in civil militias, casting itself as a nation prepared to defend its sovereignty against a superpower aggressor. This incident has become a potential and political tool for the Maduro government, allowing it to rally nationalist sentiment, distract from severe domestic economic and political crises, and portray itself as a victim uh, of the U.S. on an international world stage. Now, this has also brought a region on edge, the view from Latin America and the AOS. So let's take a look at that. Now, throughout Latin America, the U.S. action has been met with widespread alarm. The principle of non intervention is the bedrock of inter American relations, a sacred doctrine born from a painful history of U.S. military and political interference in the region. The principle is enshrined in the Charter of the Organization of American States, or the OAS. particularly in Article 19, which unequivocally states no state or group of states has the right to intervene directly or indirectly for any reason whatsoever in the internal or external affairs of another state. This prohibition covers uh, not only armed force, but any other form of interference or attempted threat against a state's personality or its political, economic, or cultural elements. In a hypothetical emergency situation of the OAS Permanent Council, the U.S. would find itself largely isolated. While a few close allies might offer muted statements, the overwhelming consensus from the regional powers like Brazil, Mexico, and even U.S. security partners like Colombia would be one of strong condemnation. This would view the unilateral strike as a dangerous violation of the OAS Charter and a regression to the era of gunboat diplomacy, in that the inter American system was created to prevent. The action would be seen as undermining regional stability and prioritizing unilateral enforcement over the cooperative multilateral approaches to security that the OAS seeks to foster. Now, let's take a look at the deadlock in New York, the UN Security Council debates. At the UN headquarters in New York, the incident has been transformed into a proxy battle between global powers. Venezuela, backed by Russia and China, has brought the issue before the Security Council, demanding condemnation of the US for an act of aggression that threatens international peace and security. The ensuing debate highlights the structural paralysis of the UN's highest body when a permanent member is the accused. Any draft resolution critical of the United States would face an immediate and certain veto, rendering the Council incapable of taking binding action. The debate would thus become a forum of political theater rather than of genuine conflict resolution. The US knows this. They can veto it and therefore walk away unscathed again and no consequences. Now, the positions are predictable and entrenched. The Russian and Chinese representatives would seize the opportunity to denounce the US hegemony and unilateral coercive measures and the hypocrisy of its rules based order. Now, framing the strike is another example of American disregard for international law. European allies such as the UK and France would find themselves in an awkward position, likely calling for de escalation and respect for international law, but carefully avoiding direct condemnation of their key transatlantic partner. The US ambassador, in turn, would vigorously defend the actions of a legitimate and necessary measure to protect American citizens from the scourge of drug trafficking, portraying the targeted vessel as a part of a dangerous transnational criminal network that threatens regional and international security. Ultimately, the incident serves as a geopolitical tool for all major players. For the United States, it's a demonstration of military resolve and a projection of power in a region where rivals are seeking influence. For Venezuela, it is a rallying cry for domestic support and international solidarity. For Russia and China, it's a valuable propaganda victory, allowing them to highlight the perceived double standards of American foreign policy and advance their own narrative as champions of state sovereignty. In terms of the digital battlefield, of course, that is playing out as well, and that is the verdict of public opinion. In the immediate aftermath of the strike, a second conflict erupted. Yeah, I'm just going to make sure that we don't lose our back here. Sorry, folks, give me one moment here. There we go, that should do the trick. Now, as I said, the information war waged across the global social media platform atmosphere or biosphere, whatever you want to call it, because it has a life of its own. As official statements trickled out, a torrent of images, claims, and counterclaims flooded X, which was formerly Twitter, Facebook, Telegram, and other networks, creating a digital battlefield where the narrative of the event was fiercely contested. This online discourse quickly became a mirror of the world's geopolitical divisions characterized by competing narratives, the rampant disinformation, and deeply polarizing public sentiment. Now, some have gone even as far as saying that they thought it was AI, excuse me, that the US video was AI generated, but that's been disproven for the most part as well. Now, the narratives and hashtags, two dominant and irreconcilable narratives, took shape within hours of the incident, each supported by its own ecosystem of accounts, media outlets, and viral content. Now, the pro US narrative framed the action as a clean, decisive blow against a dangerous enemy, propagated by US officials, and that includes the US military accounts, government spokespersons, and supportive commentators. This storyline depicted the occupants of the vessel as heavily armed narco terrorists. The content shared often included professionally produced, declassified gun camera footage of the strike and photos of U.S. naval assets on patrol, emphasizing technological prowess and military efficiency. The dominant hashtags associated with this narrative include hashtag war on drugs, hashtag narco terrorists, and hashtag protect our borders, as well as hashtag national security. The message was one of strength and righteousness and necessary action to keep deadly drugs off American streets, although we know that in the world of law and order, that shit doesn't fly. Now, the anti US and pro Venezuelan narrative. It's painting a starkly different picture of a brutal massacre and an extrajudicial killing. This is being pushed by the Venezuelan state media, allied governments, and a global network of anti imperialist activists. This narrative focused on human cost. Its featured graphic is often unverified or decontextualized images purported to be of the wreckage and its victims, frequently labeling them as innocent fishermen. The accompanying language was emotive, decrying Yankee imperialism and war crimes and a violation of sovereignty. The most common hashtags that we've seen are US war crimes, hashtag Venezuela soberana. That means Venezuela sovereignty. Also, hashtag Yankees go home and hashtag stop US aggression. Those are some of the major hashtags that have been out there. Now, a key feature of this digital conflict was the weaponization of ambiguity. The incident's remote location on the high seas meant there was no independent journalists or civilian witnesses. This information vacuum was immediately exploited by all sides. The US could claim a clean strike on a cartel vessel without fear of immediate contradiction from on the ground reporting. Conversely, its opponents could claim a massacre of civilians using the lack of verifiable information to their advantage. The battle was not over the established facts, but over which narrative could most effectively fill the void and shape the public perception. Disinformation flourished in this environment with old images from unrelated conflicts, manipulated videos, and AI generated content likely being deployed to inflame emotions and sow confusion. As I look at it, I'm looking at it from the fact that even if they were narco terrorists, they had a right to face a judge, not to be executed on the open seas. Now, the global reaction online was far more monolithic. Instead, it fractured along predictable geopolitical and cultural lines, creating a vast empathy gaps between different audiences. Within the United States, public opinion was likely divided, but leaned more favorably towards the government's position than elsewhere. Decades of war on terror rhetoric and a history of public support for forceful counterterrorism measures, such as drone strikes, have created a political environment where such actions can be seen as legitimate, particularly if the victims are successfully dehumanized as terrorists or cartel members. Now, let's keep in mind the track record of Trump and his administration on claiming people to be cartel or gang members when there's absolutely zero evidence. Now, globally, and especially in Latin America and the broader global south, the sentiment was overwhelmingly negative. For these audiences, the strike was viewed not as an isolated law enforcement action, but through the long and painful historic lens of U.S. interventionism and neocolonialism. Social media became a powerful tool for amplifying these post colonial critiques, allowing voices from the region to directly challenge the official US narrative on a global stage. Now, a sentiment analysis of the online discourse would almost certainly reveal highly polarized clusters of conversations with little to no meaningful interaction between them. One cluster would be discussing tactics, military effectiveness, and national security, while the other would be debating international law, human rights, and imperialism. This digital segregation ensures that each side is preaching to its own choir, also reinforcing pre existing beliefs and deepening the ideological chasm that separates them. The digital battlefield, in the end, did not provide a verdict, but merely a more entrenched and divided jury. Now, let's conclude here with taking a look at the dangerous precedent that this has set. The destruction of suspected drug running vessel in the Caribbean is far more than a single isolated counter narcotics operation. It is a stark and troubling illustration of a unilateralist foreign policy. Sorry about that, folks. That places domestic enforcement priorities above the established international legal order. The action represents a clear breach of the fundamental principles of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, failing to meet the stringent cumulative requirements for hot pursuit and grossly exceeding the limited authority granted under the right of visit. The legal justification offered by the United States appear to be post hoc rationalizations for an action that fundamentally disrespects the jurisdictional boundaries that ensure stability on the world's oceans. Ethically, the strike is a profound failure. It substitutes the rule of law with the rule of force, embracing extrajudicial killing as a tool of statecraft. By applying a military logic honed in the War on Terror to a law enforcement problem, the United States has bypassed the essential human rights principles of due process, necessity, and proportionality. This incident adds to the devastating human cost of a global war on drugs that has consistently fueled violence and human rights abuses while failing to achieve its stated objectives. It sets a dangerous precedent, suggesting that for the world's preeminent power, suspicion is now grounds for summary execution. The diplomatic fallout has been both predictable and damaging, isolating the United States within its own hemisphere and providing a geopolitical ammunition to its global rivals. The action has undermined the very concept of rules-based international system, reinforcing the perception that international law is a tool to be selectively applied by the powerful, rather than a universal standard that binds all nations equally. This unilateral act, justified by domestic law in defiance of international norms, threatens to erode the entire framework of the law at sea. Now, it risks encouraging other powerful nations to engage in similar extraterritorial enforcement, potentially turning the high seas into zones of conflict and competition. The incident forces a critical question upon the international community. Does the pursuit of counter narcotics goals justify dismantling the very international laws designed to prevent the unilateral use of force and protect human life? The answers from the smoldering wreckage in the Caribbean Sea appears to be a resounding and alarming no. Once again, you've been watching a special episode of Live Chat with James here on ProPix TV in Vancouver, British Columbia. You can have your say by adding your comments below. By all means, we always look forward to those. You can also email us at smile, S-M-I-L-E, at propixcanada.com. That's P-R-O-P-I-C-S Canada.com. And before we head out, I'd also like to take a moment again to thank our episode sponsor, Carry Movers Limited, K-A-R-Y Movers.com. Yes, they are Western Canada's premier long distance movers throughout Western Canada and local moving company within Metro Vancouver and the Fraser Valley. For safe, reliable, and ethical movers, contact Carry Movers once again at www.karymovers.com. Thanks for tuning in. Stay safe, everyone.